Good morning, everyone. Many thanks for joining the Climate Law and Governance Day 2022, and in particular for joining this roundtable on accelerating transition by closing the climate governance gap. It is with immense pleasure that I introduce the highly accomplished Advocate Michael Strauss, who will chair this important session. Advocate Strauss serves as General Counsel at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and has extensive commercial and development market experience. Advocate Strauss, I turn the session over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, distinguished guests, partners, and friends. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to this session. I'd like to give special thanks first to the organizers, and in particular, Dr. Marie-Claire Coulommiers-Seger, who's the Executive Secretary of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative, for putting together this year's legal conference. The growing threat of climate change will undoubtedly define this century and this generation more dramatically than any other. Even if we succeed in abating its impact, climate change will bring about profound negative economic consequences, including on financial stability, living standards, and well-being, and more widely, even on political stability. We must make a sober assessment. Achieving the transition to net zero requires trillions, and while public finance indisputably has an essential role to play in tackling the climate crisis, the crisis is too serious and too urgent to rely on the resources of public institutions alone. Strong participation of the private sector is critical. In view of their global reach and their large pool of capital, MDBs, multilateral development banks, are uniquely placed to leverage capital and steer financial flows towards low carbon and climate resilient activities. This finance must catalyze the much bigger financial flows from the private sector. MDBs have been at the forefront of supporting clients pursuing ambitious climate action for more than a decade. In light of growing climate change impacts, especially on the poorest and most vulnerable, each of our institutions is taking urgent action to help our clients adapt to and mitigate climate risks. Each institution has individually committed to support increased climate finance levels and to align operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement. In fact, between 2014 and 2021, MDBs jointly committed a total of approximately $340 billion in climate finance, of which approximately $240 billion was directed at low and middle income countries. As a majority private sector bank, EBRD plays a pivotal role in shifting, catalyzing financial flows managed by the private sector. EBRD's private sector mobilization ratio is very high. For every dollar of finance we provided in 2021, we leveraged more than $2 of private finance. EBRD also has become one of the first financial institutions to commit to align all of its lending and investments with the goals of the Paris Agreement starting from January 1st. Alongside this catalyzation of private sector investment in climate projects, the transition to a low carbon, resilient economy is leading to a growing demand for more and better information from businesses about how they are assessing, managing, and disclosing about climate-related risks and opportunities, and how they are integrating these actions into their risk management practices, their business strategies, and their corporate governance. On the one hand, we see a rapid mainstreaming of corporate climate finance governance practices, especially climate risk disclosure into financial supervision, which illustrates the important links between climate risks and the stability of the financial system. This is happening alongside a rapidly evolving legal environment for corporate climate action, including the rise of shareholder activism, which aims to bring about a broader societal shift. On the other hand, we sometimes see significant lack of preparedness for and awareness of climate-related risks among businesses, in part in our region of operation, which means we still have quite a lot of work to do. In this context, we're delighted for today's opportunity, together with our valued partners, to raise awareness of the essential role of lawyers from the public and private sector that they can play in accelerating the transition by closing the climate governance gap. The first part of today's session will focus on the role of MDBs in supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement, in particular through their unique business model of mobilizing finance and combining investment with policy support and technical assistance. The second part will focus on the role of corporate boards in steering companies towards a net zero transition as businesses navigate myriad frameworks, standards, and other guidance on sustainability reporting and climate-related disclosures. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce the panelists before I give the floor to my good friend Tom Clark from ADB to deliver the opening remarks. First, let me welcome the General Counsel of the Green Climate Fund, Douglas Lees, to tell us about how GCF promotes the transition towards Paris alignment through its projects. Douglas has a wealth of experience in legal affairs, including a tenure as General Counsel of the Caribbean Development Bank. He holds the rank of King's Counsel, a position reserved for persons who have distinguished themselves in the bar of the Commonwealth. Since 2018, Douglas has led the Office of the General Counsel of the Green Climate Fund, and it's truly fantastic that you found the time to join us today, Douglas. It's great to see you. Next, EBRD's Veselina Haralampieva will present the EBRD's approach to Paris alignment and its work bridging the climate governance gap. As the energy and climate change lead at EBRD's legal department, Veselina works closely with banking lawyers and advises on matters relating to clean energy, climate law and policy, and sustainability governance. More generally, she's initiated client and policy initiatives in the field of corporate climate governance and sustainability, about which I hope she will tell us quite a bit more. Thanks, Vessi. We also have Emily Farnsworth, the co-director of the Center for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall and Cambridge University. Emily will tell us about how policy support can help businesses improve corporate governance practices to account for climate-related risks and opportunities, and the importance of the World Economic Forum's climate governance principles in this respect. She has over 25 years of experience working with businesses, governments, and nonprofit organizations to support the transition to a low-carbon economy. She was previously the head of climate initiatives at the World Economic Forum, where she helped set up the climate governance initiative. Welcome, Emily. And last, but by no means least, we think we will have, I'll introduce her in the hopes that she's still joining, Anna Maria Slot, who's the Global Sustainability Partner of Ashurst LLP, who will tell us about how businesses can effectively navigate the multitude of frameworks, standards, and other guidance on sustainability reporting and climate-related disclosures. Anna Marie has 2 decades of experience acting for investment banks and companies in a wide range of corporate finance and securities transactions, and now is the Global Sustainability Partner leading the firm's ESG strategy. So I look forward to an insightful discussion, and we'll pass the baton now to my good friend Tom Clark to kick off this session by telling us more about ADB's climate commitments and climate-related policy projects. Over to you, Tom.
Mike, thank you very, very much for that warm introduction. And let me please give warm greetings from Manila in the Philippines to my fellow speakers, distinguished members of the Academy and legal community, and all respected colleagues, guests, and friends. I'm sorry not to be joining you in person. I guess I can claim some moral virtue by just staying here at home and not getting on a plane and flying there. But nonetheless, it is very nice to see your faces and to really participate in this incredibly timely discussion. It's absolutely true what Mike said. You know, climate governance is fundamental, absolutely fundamental to achieving our net zero future. And it's going to require big changes, entire systems overhaul at all levels, including at multilateral development banks, at governments, and in the private sector. And I'd like to speak a little bit at Mike's invitation to the role of MDBs, and of course, I'm happy to take questions later. But the multilateral development banks really have been, I think it's no overstatement, Mike, when you said it, at the forefront of this governance transition, which is really required to tackle the climate crisis. I mean, for example, MDBs have agreed on a common methodology for tracking climate mitigation and adaptation finance. And they've actually been issuing, as you know, the joint report of multilateral development banks climate finance every year since 2015. The most recent joint MDB report issued in October, just last month, reported that climate finance committed by the major MDBs rose by more than 24% in 2021 compared to 2020. So at the ADB, we raised our climate finance ambition from 2019 to 2030 from 80 billion to 100 billion. Some of you will recall that we actually announced that just about a year ago this time in Glasgow. And of that, 34 billion is earmarked for adaptation. Now, if you look kind of historically at the sweep of a number of these commitments, go back to 2017 at the One Planet Summit, MDBs jointly announced their commitment to align their financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then at COP24 in 2018, they presented the joint MDB Paris alignment approach. And since then, they've been, I think, putting those words into action. We have outlined a framework to assess the alignment of investment projects with the goals of the Paris Agreement, as well as operationalizing the Paris alignment across each institution and committing to a timeline for Paris alignment. You know, there's a lot of criticism, and we cannot complain about it when they say, you know, there are lots of meetings and words come out and, you know, commitments are made, but it really won't matter unless there are metrics to look at it, to measure it, to operationalize it, and to make sure that the rubber meets the road. It is a broad approach framework, and it really necessarily does leave some room, though, for each MDB to consider its policy and institutional requirements, looking at regional realities. And I think some of this is just the result that, you know, we do work in different regions. There are certain needs of our developing member country clients that need to be taken into account, but the overall framework of Paris has to be adhered to in this in terms of the alignment and the trajectory. Now, at COP27, all the MDBs reported that they are on track to meet their individual Paris alignment commitments with institutions at different stages of piloting or implementation. For the ADB's case, we committed to fully align ADB's sovereign operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement by July 1, 2023, and our non-sovereign operations, which is a growing part of our portfolio, by the 1st of July, 2025. And in fact, we've come out with a Paris alignment guidance note that will help our staff internally to operationalize this. Furthermore, since 2014, we've been mainstreaming climate change into all aspects of our operations, being the first MDB to mandate climate change risk screening of our projects with the establishment of a climate risk management framework. More recently, our ADB Board of Directors has approved a new operating model, which will require structural changes, basically changes to our internal guidelines and processes in the way we work, in order to move toward our ambition, which was announced, of becoming Asia's climate bank. So I think you can see from all of these steps that there have been a number of ambitions that have been set out, but I want to say that having the ambition is just the start. You have to have a framework and a methodology for operationalizing those ambitions, and it has to actually be internalized and integrated into the way we work as a business. And that's one of the things that we're making central to our ongoing new operating model, which was recently announced. Now, MDBs have also cooperated on the task force on climate-related financial disclosures reporting. As you know, this is a major initiative coming out of the G20 and FSB process. Of course, many private sector commercial banks are already well on their way and have a few years under their belt in TCFD disclosures, and MDBs and institutions certainly have been getting into the game. In September of this year, ADB released our inaugural climate-related financial disclosures report. We may not be quite up to you, Mike, but we're trying to keep up. And among the highlights of ADB's progress on implementing the TCFD framework has been the formation of a climate action coordination committee. Now, the Climate Action Coordination Committee is an important body with senior leadership from the highest levels of the bank, and we're reporting to ADB's Managing Director General to help oversee the planning, the implementation, the monitoring, and the coordination of ADB's actions so as to meet our climate goals. And we have an interdepartmental working group that was also formed last year to adopt the TCFD recommendations and to drive public reporting going forward. So again, it's about putting mechanics in, putting the governance in that will actually make the ambitions into a reality. Furthermore, MDBs are committing to mainstreaming what we call the just transition and the social inclusion considerations, which are so important in relevant policies and plans or in projects. It's one thing to have the climate goals, but it is absolutely necessary in order to make them sustainable, in order to secure the political will and the social consensus on them, that we have a commitment to a just transition that accompanies that very closely. And ADB has launched its Just Transition Support Platform. This is very interesting because actually on November 14th at the MDB Pavilion, we're going to have a formal launch of this to really we look at the support platform to be a means to help strengthen our work in the just transition space. And it seeks to ensure that the benefits of the shift to the low carbon resilient economies are shared equally, and that no individual, community, or region, no particular set of workers is going to be left behind. Again, to maintain and secure that broad consensus, it is absolutely essential that the benefits and the burdens be shared communally and not be concentrated in one group versus another. ADB's Just Transition Support Platform is a multi-sector technical assistance platform to build the capacity of its developing member countries to strategically plan, implement, and finance this just transitions. And we hope those tools will be very well tailored to help our client DMCs achieve that. Now, at the same time, MDBs are also working to advance inclusion and equality of opportunity for women and for vulnerable groups to improve their resilience to the impacts of climate change. And at ADB, our policy is already geared to promote gender equality and inclusive development. But in particular, ADB recognizes that the interactions among gender, climate change, and the rule of law are very critical. Globally, we all know that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change and disasters due to gender inequalities and the limited opportunities to participate in decision-making processes. So it's critical that when we look at these projects that we make sure that the gender impacts are considered and that those and other vulnerable communities are taken into consideration in the remediation efforts. Recently, ADB published a knowledge resource on how to integrate gender equality in laws and policies on climate change and disaster management in ADB's developing member countries. I mean, you can't just preach to, be inclusive and include gender in this. You have to provide the capacity building and the technical assistance to help them do it. And the report provides a conceptual framework and a good practice guide to improve gender equality in this space based on international norms and examples of national laws. It also demonstrates how gender responsive laws and policies can contribute to women's resilience to climate change and disasters. This is very important in a lot of our most vulnerable countries, including some of our small island developing countries. The report was developed for the use of governments, policymakers, organizations, and individuals engaged in gender responsive legislative reforms. And I really hope that it will be a very valuable tool for these countries going forward. Let me, if I have just a couple of minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about the national level, which is very important, bring this down into, individual countries. Countries have started making whole of economy shifts and realigning their institutions and systems to decarbonize and adapt. And I think, many of you who are at the Excellent Climate Conference that was sponsored at the University of Oslo just back in early October will recall how much focus there was on these whole economy shifts that need to take place. This is not a niche thing. This has to be a whole of economy approach to make it work. And so in this regard, I'm happy to point out that one of the ways that we see countries attempting to put in place whole of economy climate governance shifts is through enactment of framework climate change laws. And this will maybe be a little bit repetitive to those who were in Oslo, but we are very proud of one of the things that we've worked a lot on through our law and policy reform program, which was Fiji's climate change law enacted in September of 2021, which we assisted with through that TA. And it was critical in making Paris mainstreaming really one of the first comprehensive national laws. And to have it take place in a very vulnerable and threatened economy in the Pacific region like Fiji, I think was quite an accomplishment. And individual country approaches, of course, will vary based on circumstances and legal regimes, but they have to have some Paris alignment as part of that law, such as was included in the Fiji new law that was passed in 2021. Now, at this COP27, MDBs issued a joint statement on their commitment to expand support for countries and other clients in particular to formulate policies to spur systemic change and provide the legal and regulatory certainty to attract investment, going from green projects to greening whole economies. In particular, under our OGC LPR program, we have been actively engaging with legal and judicial stakeholders to improve climate legal frameworks and climate governance. For example, under our Legal Readiness for Climate Finance and Climate Investment program, we have been assisting our client countries with reforms to optimize options for climate finance and to address barriers to climate investments by helping to improve the enabling legal environment for private sector development and for FDI and key sectoral laws and regulations, as well as to assist in establishing a framework for climate change and disaster management laws. Furthermore, under our LPR program, we have a judicial capacity building program to assist judges in more effective adjudication of complex climate change and environmental disputes by equipping them with the knowledge, resources, and networking with other judges and connecting them to experts. And of course, this was a critical theme in the role of the judiciary in combating climate change that was discussed in Oslo. And, for those who were there, you'll know that, sometimes we forget about judges. We forget about the critical role that judiciaries play in interpreting laws, in interpreting constitutional provisions, in interpreting, international treaties like Paris, and giving them the teeth and the operationalization that they need at the national level. So we find that engagement with judiciaries to be absolutely critical. So, over the last 12 years, we've been making a lot of investments in judges, given their critical role and enforcement of environmental and climate change laws. The IPCC has also acknowledged the growing body of climate litigation and its capacity to influence the outcome and ambition of climate governance. So ignore the judiciary at your peril. This is a critical partner for us as we look at building capacity in that whole of economy approach. Now, I mentioned the whole of economy approach to strengthening climate legal frameworks, but there is a need for a whole of economy integrated and multi-stakeholder approach to effectively implement these climate frameworks in our client countries. This means including judges as important stakeholders, yes, but all branches of government must be well-informed, trained, and efficient to bring about these whole of government shifts. So the judiciary, yes, but policymakers, regulators, the bureaucracy, all of those who are involved in implementing rules, we cannot overlook any of them as essential partners in these whole of economy shifts. I should also just mention that, you have to look at this as a timeline. This is obviously, we're in it for the long term, and we have to look not only at those who are in power today, we have to look at tomorrow's generation, tomorrow's future leaders. Those are the people that are going to really be suffering if we don't get this right, and they're the people that we need to empower now. And so to that end, we've also been partnering with legal education boards and law schools to strengthen environmental and climate change legal education through our Developing Environmental Law Champions program. And these environmental legal education programs activate a virtuous cycle of knowledge transfer required to influence sustainability outcomes in the rising generation of leaders in government, private sector, academia, and other spheres, many of whom, of course, are in universities or in law faculty now. And so influencing and upgrading the curricula there to train these future leaders on the need for climate governance is absolutely critical. Let me just very briefly say a word about the private sector. Now, as we look across countries, there are different stages of adapting governance models to address climate change and risks and opportunities in the private sector. Throughout this process, companies and financial institutions have been struggling with what the appropriate climate governance arrangements should look like against the backdrop of a often very quickly evolving legal and regulatory environment and varying standards on climate risk disclosure, on financial reporting, on green standards. I mean, we all know how there's not coherence yet. Europe, US, Asian countries, a lot of difference. It's obviously a challenge for a lot of companies trying to, have an approach that they can implement and not be, sort of second guessed by evolving standards. I think the gap is more prevalent in the Asia Pacific region, where legal and regulatory frameworks are more fragmented and countries are at different stages of development. So working toward more harmonization and coherence at a global level so that we can have more predictability in those frameworks, I think will be an important step to help really catalyze more private sector investment, which is so necessary. In conclusion, let me just say that climate governance landscape that we face is evolving. Multiple actors are working at different levels. It's critical that we work together to put in place a holistic and coherent global, national, and local climate government set of arrangements. So I really look forward to this roundtable discussion, to hear ideas from our expert panel, how we can strengthen climate governance on all levels to implement the Paris Agreement. It's really, nothing could be more important. I'm so looking forward to talking with you, and thank you very much, to Mike and EBRD for inviting me, and to my fellow panelists. I look forward to our discussion today. Thanks.
Tom, thank you so much. And it was especially really interesting to hear you talk about mainstreaming the just transition and what ADB has been doing there, which I think is even a massive advancement on the time when I was at ADB. And also the role of the judiciary, which we at EBRD think is very important, which I'm sure Vasilina will mention in her intervention. So I will move now to Douglas Lees and ask you, if you don't mind, to give us a bit of a background on what the Green Climate Fund is doing to ensure financial flows are Paris aligned.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And it was good to hear Tom and the initiatives that they are pursuing at ADB. I'm really impressed with those initiatives. What I would like to say is from a different tact altogether, because as you know, the GCF has been set up under the UNFCCC and is a primary financial mechanism for climate change under the Paris Agreement. As such, we have a narrower mandate than the MDBs because we're just climate and we're looking at projects which have that climate rationale. That's where our money goes. We have no other interest in development financing. It's that particular dedicated mission that we are on. And as such, the GCF falls into the category of not a multilateral bank, but a multilateral fund. And in that context, we are charged with ensuring under Paris Agreement 21C, the financial flows into developing countries for climate change so that they can pursue paradigm shift along what they call climate resilient pathways. And we have been doing that, as you know, over the past few years, channeling these resources. However, I must say now that the GCF is at a crossroads in terms of its development as an institution, because albeit we have an impressive amount of projects under our belt, we are still being pushed by the COP and our board to do more. And we are being pushed now in the direction of, as Tom had mentioned, the private sector and the need to channel resources into the private sector and get those flows from the private sector into climate, sustainable climate projects. With the climate emergency upon us and the guidance of the COP, we are now invoking what we call the GCF's catalytic role. In this regard, the GCF, we have done a great deal of introspection and we have examined ways in which we can exploit or leverage our unique position in terms of where we are in the global climate landscape and as well as the financial resources under our command. And we have a number of projects. In fact, one of them is being unfolded at the COP this year, which we call the Green Guarantee Company. I'm not sure if any of you guys are participants in that, but this is a company which is being established. And the focal point in that company is that it's going to be a guarantee company. GCF is taking an equity stake in that company, and along with other development institutions, that company will pursue a credit rating, investment grade credit rating, and then it will be able to guarantee projects for the private sector throughout developing countries. Now, we feel that this is a unique way for us in which we can channel resources at the scale which certainly the COP and our board would like to see. In the last COP26, the private sector has admitted that there was $130 trillion under its control, which could be directed into climate sustainable activity. And it is with that objective in mind that we feel at the Green Climate Fund that we can play a significant role in channeling these resources from the private sector into developing countries. And one of the ways or the mechanisms through which we're doing this is the Green Guarantee Company, because GCF is starting with a seed capital of, I think it's around 80 million. And when you look at the leverage, which that company will be able to exploit, GCF investment can be multiplied 20, or I think it's 20 times the amount that we are putting in, which would give a total, as they say, the company would have 4.5 billion in leverage. Now that's a significant amount which we can put into climate activities throughout the globe if we follow that model. And we are pursuing that. And the objective is, if this is successful, to replicate that model across the globe so that that would command a large amount of financial flows into developing countries from the private sector. Of course, that comes with a challenge, which I think Tom has identified. And one of those challenges we face is the challenge of what I think Megan Bauman has called legal readiness. And I hear Tom also accepting that particular phraseology. And we are finding that to attract private sector flows into developing countries, then we need to have the appropriate regulatory framework. For instance, when we go to the private sector and we try to entice them to invest in projects, one of the big questions they're asked, well, where is the data? What's it for the last 10, 15 years? Of course, these countries do not have the data. So through our readiness program, we are putting in the appropriate weather systems to allow them to collect the data so that they're able to display data to the private sector. Of course, when you talk about renewable energy projects in these countries, you are looking at the appropriate regulatory framework, the tariff structure, how are increases to be made if you're using renewable energy, inflation and that kind of a thing. The private sector wants fairness, they want transparency. And these are some of the issues which we face in these countries, and which through our readiness program, we are looking at developing the appropriate regulatory frameworks to ensure that these countries are, if I may put it this way, private sector ready and ready to receive private sector finance, because we can have the best will in the world of wanting to challenge these flows into these countries. But if they're not ready, the private sector, which is profit driven, they're not going to be taking on those risks as we do from our public sector kind of projects. I want to close off here by saying one of the biggest challenges we face is that the GCF is now in its second replenishment, what we call GCF2, where every 4 years we go to our donors and ask for contributions to fund us for the next 4 years. We have launched earlier on this year, GCF2. As you know, the global atmosphere is such that rising inflation, there's a war in Ukraine, supply chain issues, etc. Countries or traditional donor countries are under tremendous strain. And we are looking very shaky going into next year, but we are hoping that we will be able to get a successful replenishment and that countries will step up their contributions, because without those contributions, then the GCF will not be able to discharge its mandate. As you know, unlike the development banks, we don't have a market where we can go to for capital to sustain us. We depend a great deal on contributions. So that's our biggest challenge to date. And we're hoping that with some of the powerhouses here, you will encourage your respective governments to contribute significantly to the GCF's pool of resources that we now have, because without that, we won't be able to carry on the work we have been doing. I want to close off here and hand it back to you, Mike.
Douglas, thank you so much. And we are all wishing you enormous good luck with your replenishment, and in particular, recognizing that there's really nothing more important than the work that you do. And so we hope that governments see the same urgency and fill the coffers at the GCF in the replenishment. I'm going to move over now to Veselina and ask you, Veselina, what does the EBRD plan to do to become Paris aligned, and what is the role of lawyers and legal in getting that done?
Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning to all joining us today. Many thanks to Mary Claire and the Climate Law and Governance Initiative for making all this possible. It's a real honor to be part of the panel and to help put it together, and also discuss with our esteemed co-panelists the significant role of multilateral development banks in channeling climate finance and promoting alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement in the regions where we operate. So to begin very briefly, I just wanted to clarify what we mean by climate finance, why it's important. Climate finance is, broadly speaking, the capital that is needed, coming both from the public and private sources, to support the mitigation and adaptation actions to address climate change. Climate finance is required to fund actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050, or otherwise known as the net zero goal. And it's also used to increase the resilience of people, of communities, particularly the most vulnerable ones, improve the resilience of the infrastructure and the businesses we work with against the negative impacts of climate change. So We've heard a lot about the need for a large-scale investment in order to fund this broad range of high-priority climate actions. Just as an illustration, the IPCC estimates that limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees would require global energy investments of around $3.5 trillion a year until 2050. So that's a considerable amount. And it's really vital that all our present activities and all the investment decisions support the net zero goal and contribute to building a resilient and sustainable future. That's why we are today here to discuss also in particular the role of MDBs, whose mission is to foster social, economic and sustainable development, in particular in the transition and emerging and developing countries, in order to take urgent and decisive measures to steer societies and economies towards reaching a net zero economy. So very quick few facts about EBRD. Same as all the other sister MDBs, we have committed to align all our operations with the Paris Agreement. And in fact, we're one of the first IFIs that are ready to meet this commitment in less than 2 months' time. So on the 1st of January 2023, we will align all our operations with the Paris Agreement. Additionally, we have a broader kind of green transition strategic document where we are committed to helping countries to that we operate in to build green and low carbon and resilient economy. So last year, for an illustration, we invested 5.4 billion euros in green finance, supporting mitigation, adaptation, and broader environmental activities. In addition, we are the first MDBs to sign up to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that Tom kindly referred to, and the first ones to issue our report. So we just, before the COP, we issued our third report on our internal governance and risk management of climate-related financial risks. And of course, the way we report and we engage with our clients to help them also integrate the TCFD recommendations in their operations. So we also heard a lot about the need to develop the methodologies to ensure that there is the metrics, there is all the kind of the systemic and robust approach in aligning whether our investment is aligned or non-aligned. So I just wanted to emphasize that in operationalizing our Paris alignment methodology, the EBRD is guided by the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. I think that's quite important considering some of the recent publications about the commitment of the global investment community. So I want to talk in the remaining time about what is, very briefly, our methodology. So I give you a sense to understand how detailed this is, and some of the policy products that we are developing for our clients and for broadly the countries and where we work and the broader group of stakeholders. So as a bank, we have broadly 3 kinds of operations. So in terms of investment, so one is the directly financed operations, where we engage directly with corporates to finance investment or to finance their activities. For this, the methodology is already in place. So all the projects are already being assessed against this methodology. So this, the metrics entails a robust assessment based on 2 conditions. So one is to define that each project is consistent with the long-term low carbon development. This, of course, is supported by a very detailed list of sectors and additional metrics that I'll not get into it. But I think it's important to say that this is the first criteria, the first conditions that we look at. The other one is a low likelihood of carbon lock-in. So this is to give assurance that the project will not enable an emissions-intensive asset to continue operating. So a preference for lower always carbon options will be given. For some projects, it is very straightforward assessment. For example, when there is a limited carbon footprint or when there is no direct exposure to physical climate risks. For others, especially those that entail certain GHG emissions, this requires a further detailed analysis. And in this detailed analysis, we're looking at the national climate targets. So we're looking at the nationally determined contributions and how the project contributes to the national level climate commitments. Looking at the sector long-term strategies for decarbonization and some other policy plans, also at national legislation where it exists. And we are also using an economic assessment, applying a shadow carbon price. This is also an important kind of point to underline that, as it was mentioned already, in many of our country's operations, there is not existent climate change legislation or policies or instruments or sector pathways that we could measure our projects against in terms of consistency. So this also informs our policy and our legal reform work. So how we can support our country's operations to develop such policies and legislation that is aligned with Paris. So each project, in addition to an assessment of its mitigation consistencies or mitigation goals, we also assess it for its climate change adaptation contributions. So then this is a very much more physical analysis. So we look at how physical climate risks have been identified, how they're dealt with, whether there is any contradiction with some of the national or local policies. And this is also a very granular approach. But the outcome is that a project will be only financed if indeed it advances the national physical climate risks commitments, and that contributes to building resilience in the community broader than the project. The other group of financing operations that I wanted to highlight, and this is very important, is, as it's the majority of EBRD's investment, is the so-called indirect finance. So this is when we work with banks, with financial institutions in our country's operations. And I would say that the methodology for aligning our indirect finance with Paris is quite an innovative one, and we hope that it will inform similar efforts of Paris alignment with other international financial institutions. So this assessment goes through four, let's say, big pillars. In pillar one, this is for each project with a bank or other financial institution, we will require our client to commit to Paris alignment in the financing agreement. So each client will commit to working towards aligning their financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I would say that this is a very important commitment, because this first is the kind of the signal that is needed for our clients to know that, well, first we really want to work with them to align their financial flows with Paris, and we can provide all the support that is needed. But on their side, they have to commit to work with us to develop the necessary policies, strategies, to reassess their portfolio, and to work also with their borrowers, with their clients, so that they increase the capacity of the corporates in the region, so also SMEs, in relation to climate-related risks and opportunities. So this is, I think, the key to the transformational impact that we heard about, and how MDBs will be contributing to this paradigm shift that is required to meet Paris goals. So I mentioned there are four pillars. The second, so once we sign this legal agreement, and we start this journey with the client, what we want to assess from day one is if we will get clear confidence that the financing that EBRD provides will be directed to sub-projects that are Paris aligned. So as I mentioned, this it really goes beyond our individual assessment. We're looking at at the Paris alignment of our clients, and in particular here we have a lot of requirements, and we exclude any investment in coal and upstream oil. We exclude also investment in upstream gas. In cases where we cannot get such confidence that all our financing will go to climate-aligned investments from the partner financial institutions, then we go into pillar 3, which is an assessment of the business of these banks. So it's called the counterparty assessment, to understand their climate-related business practices. So here we will dedicate technical assistance and also a lot of time of the bank staff to assess the current approach to climate action of the financial institution. How does it compare to leading market and regulatory practices? How can we help them develop climate-related strategies and climate governance? How can help them have a better assessment of climate risks? And of course, this is underpinned by a requirement for disclosure. And here I would open the brackets that this very much also links to another policy initiative that we have started, and this is the corporate climate governance. So this is the engagement with our counterparties on their climate governance and climate risk management. I'll mention this at the end in further detail. So this would entail, we're moving to the 4th pillar. This type of assessment will entail developing a transition plan, which will be, have a very credible milestones. It will be having, certain targets, and again, an assessment of the whole portfolio of the bank. So ensuring that our banks become TCFD aligned and Paris aligned over time. So this type of approach will apply to all banks, and as part of this transition planning, in a couple of years' time, we would ask the banks to publish their transition plans. So to be completely transparent, not only to us, but also to the broader community of their decarbonization goals, and as I mentioned, of how they plan to deliver on their commitments. So I also wanted to mention that the 3rd category of investments that broadly kind of can put it all in one bracket, that the bank does is equity investments or some other types of financing. So the methodology for this type of financing is a combination of the 2 approaches that you heard. So direct investment and the counterparty assessment and development of transition plans, and working on climate governance and climate reporting, which is underpinned by very strict time-bound milestones and other commitments. So the Paris alignment methodology of the bank is also complemented by our work with leading initiatives and organizations on policy, on regulation, on developing best practices for climate action. So I'm not going to mention all of them, but it's important just to note here that we work with the Network for Greening the Financial System. So we work with them on developing transition plans, ensuring that our engagement with clients, our kind of policy work is also consistent with the international standards developed by financial regulators, by central banks. So there is consistency here. We're also working with them on, I think it was mentioned only on this emerging climate litigation risk and legal risks, so to understand this better for our clients and to help them in this journey. We also work very closely with the Climate Governance Initiative and with policy support groups such as the NDC platform and others. But so I think what I'm trying to convey here is that in our Paris alignment methodology, we very much kind of bound together the investment, the policy work, our legal reform work as well, our engagement with financial regulators and central banks in the economies where we operate. I wanted just a couple of points to mention the Corporate Climate Governance Initiative. So just as a bit of news before the official launch, which is next week. So this is this was piloted for the last couple of years, a support to financial institutions, to corporates, and to municipal clients, as well as mentioned, policymakers and others, as a bespoke advisory services, engaging with them to help them upgrade their businesses, improve their climate governance, and plan a green transition in order to bring them in line with international best practices. So that's a donor-funded facility. Initially, now we funded with 30 million euros, and based on the increasing demands, this plans to grow. So the key outcomes of that is to develop credible transition plans for our clients, with them and for them, to build capabilities, tools, and processes at every level, clients, regulators, policymakers, even cities and municipalities. So ensuring that in all levels of engagement of EBRD, we work with our clients and the broader group of stakeholders to adopt best practice policies and frameworks compatible with net zero and with emerging global standards. And of course, making a very strong case that especially in view of the policy, market, and regulatory shift, this type of assistance will unlock finance for green investments for our clients. The other policy product, which is very much about climate governance for boards, I will, I think that Emily, who is the director for climate engagement, will tell us more about it. But for us, yesterday, well, a couple of days ago here in Sharm, we launched the first initiative in Egypt. We call it Chapter Zero Egypt, which is really focused on providing the tools, the capacity building, the training to board members in order to develop their skills and help them incorporate climate change considerations into the business making and operations of their corporate. So it's a flagship initiative of EBRD, because we believe that working with boards today will help and will define sustainable businesses of tomorrow. Just as highlights, we have started this year a program to engage with judiciaries in our country's operations, very much in coordination with ADB and inspired by their long-term experience, which is dedicated to help to work with judges, helping them to have this effective adjudication of climate change related disputes, establishing a network of judges across our region, really to exchange experience and to build provide them with tools and capacity. And I guess with this, I would like to conclude at this stage, and I look forward to continuous discussions with the esteemed panelists and broadly, with all of you on the line, and with partners and clients and decision makers and policy makers in our country's operations, so that we all jointly collaborate to achieve the Paris goals. Back to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veselina. And your intervention is very intentionally connected to Emily's intervention, because I think you'll both be two sides of the same coin. Emily, coming from Hughes Hall, which now, thanks to Marie-Claire, has an important place in my heart as well, after I spoke there a few weeks ago. So thank you for that. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit, and unfortunately we're running short on time, so we have to be a little bit more concise now. But what is the role of governance, as Veselina mentioned, in delivering the climate agenda at the corporate level? And especially, how do you propose to bridge that governance gap in emerging markets?
Thank you very much, Mike, and delightful to be here. Maybe just to bring in the conversation around what's happening within the private sector. And we've already heard a little bit earlier that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was really a game changer in the context of how corporate boards are thinking about their responsibilities, their approach to taking on board a review of risks and opportunities of climate impacts, not just in the context of how that interacts and sort of what the impact is on their stakeholders, but more importantly, the financial risk associated with both their own operations and those across their supply chain too. We were very taken with the interactions that I was having when I was at the World Economic Forum around what can we do to support boards in accelerating their ability to implement the task force recommendations, And the element of governance was something that we were particularly attracted to digging into. And that really is where the Climate Governance Initiative began, with a set of principles, a set of 8 principles for effective climate governance on boards. It was targeted at the private sector primarily, but obviously there are elements relevant to any organization looking at having a conversation in the boardroom about what effective climate governance means. The initiative has really grown. We launched the principles in 2019. And since then, there have been groups of non-exec directors, independent directors, chairs who've been working closely with different institutions in their local jurisdiction to develop local chapters. We now have 24 local chapters around the world who between them are covering 56 countries in the context of working with boards locally. And that really is to drive both awareness of climate risk and opportunity at the very, very basic level, to build capacity of what board directors need to be thinking about and the questions that they need to be bringing into the boardroom. And also now we're kind of getting, once we sort of get a better level of awareness and capacity building, to start to bring the tools that they need to work with their boards. I would say that one of the things that we're learning, and there is a big difference between how far boards can go where they're in a jurisdiction that have very clear climate policy, climate frameworks, commitments to Paris aligned goals, and very clear signals of how that particular country is going to deliver on their nationally determined contribution. And so we know that although we're very focused on engaging the board directors in country, ultimately we need to engage policymakers and governments to support or to provide the supporting frameworks for these businesses to go much, much faster. But what we are doing is equipping this network with the right questions to ask, the right sort of levers to pull, if you like, in the context of being able to invest in the right places, able to tackle the climate risks, but more importantly, I guess, in the context of their fiduciary responsibilities, the financial risks associated with some of the decisions that they're making. Just on that point of fiduciary responsibility, we have, one of the things that we do within the Climate Governance Initiative is build out content so that we can share that across the network. We have a very comprehensive document that outlines in all the key jurisdictions that we're engaging what those fiduciary responsibilities are in the context of climate. There's a recognition that the trends that are moving now indicates that it's no longer okay for boards to be only thinking about their financial responsibilities to shareholders. It's very clear that climate change has an impact on the bottom line of most organizations. And it's really clear that in order to be a going concern into the future, that they need to be thinking about and tackling climate risks and opportunities. And so I think that kind of education and understanding within board directors of what this means from a legal perspective is really critical. One of the other aspects that we're looking into is that, again, as we're working with more and more directors who understand how important this issue is and how, asking questions of how they bring it into the board, it also raises the question of how they're interacting with general counsel, their company secretaries, in-house counsel, the private firms that are also providing advice to those businesses. And one of the things that we've launched this week is a law and climate atlas, which starts to look at where we can use existing regulation to drive, to drive understanding about how we use existing laws and regulation to utilize what we can today as we wait for some of the new policies and regulations and legislation to follow into the future. And I think this desire that there is to start to engage more between the legal community and board directors. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of focus on climate litigation, but I think there's a recognition that it's not just about the sticks that are appearing to corporate boards who are facing challenges around the litigation agenda. It's also about, how can we really work more or engage more with the legal community to support on some of the opportunities that the law offers to go faster, to look more creatively about how do we really kind of dig into some of the assumptions that we've made for decades previously and actually kind of refresh how we can use existing regulation to drive change in the boardroom today. We all know how desperately urgent this problem is. And so it's about, really kind of accelerating and using what we have in our current form. I appreciate we're tight on time today, but maybe just one final point. I think from our perspective with the Climate Governance Initiative, the partnership with the EBRD has been extremely valuable for us. We've been able to already launch chapters in the region, which we know are going to be making a significant difference. And I think the other point that was raised earlier is just the need for collaboration between the private sector and the development banks is so key, particularly in emerging economies where we need that kind of balance between public sector investment to cover risk and the private sector stepping in to really offer the longer term opportunities to build the infrastructure, build the operations, deliver the the growth of the economy that we need on the ground. And so I really do underscore that kind of real opportunity we have to work more closely together. So it's been a delight so far to be working with the EBRD, and we're looking forward to more of that collaboration as we grow our network globally. So thank you so much for the opportunity to bring that perspective into this discussion.
Emily, thank you so much both for being very, very clear, very compelling, and also very brief. And again, I apologize that we're running a little bit over time, but I will try to keep us within the allotted time. I know Marie-Claire will be very pleased if we do. And so I think we'll have to skip questions, but we will get to everyone for the panel at least. And that brings me to a good friend and somebody I'm very pleased to hear from, Anna Marie Slot. And in particular, Anna Marie, since some of the other areas you work on have been discussed in some detail, I wanted to ask you about something Tom raised early on, which is how businesses can navigate the multitude of frameworks and standards and other guidance on sustainability and climate reporting, and how you help clients do that to reduce climate-related risk, but also improve their climate governance.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael, and thank you for having me join this fantastic panel. Yeah, it's a difficult one for businesses, obviously, because there, as Tom says, there are frameworks across the world that are all very different. I mean, it's not that is not intrinsically different from other things outside of climate. There are lots of regulations that sit at different levels that companies are now, choosing to comply with or having to comply with around the world. Companies generally, if they're in that situation, what they end up doing is they end up having to comply with the most rigid for the world, right? And so if you're operating in the EU and the EU has the most stringent regulation, you end up having to build your systems internally into your company for that EU information or that EU requirements, et cetera, et cetera. I think the real challenge that climate brings that those other areas don't bring is the newness of it and the overall awareness and forward-looking aspects of it, which is really where the governance is difficult for companies, because companies just always, you look at what was, and then you think about how that will affect, and then you move forward in determining your strategies and your plans. But here with climate, it is very much new information for a lot of companies that they haven't looked at before, and they don't understand necessarily what that scenario looks like, because it is a scenario of what happens forward. So, I mean, I think where companies are really struggling is, trying to assess that the magnitude of what that could mean for them. And that's where, direction from the board is integral. But the board is also a group of people who are used to talking about things they know about, right? And so I think the real challenge in this whole area is to say to people, yes, we need more data. To Douglas's point this morning earlier is yes, we definitely need more data. Yes, we need more information. Yes, this is new, but we have to look to places like Chapter Zero and other work that's being done globally to pull that information into the business and say, these are actually new information points that you need to be building into these decision models, right? You need to have on the fifth bullet of every checklist that you're doing, what's the climate impact? And if you don't know, you just need to go out and search for that information. And things like what EBRD is putting together, all of that builds that know-how, but people have to be able to say, right now, I don't know what that looks like in my scenario, and I need to build that into my scenario. And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about, but I think is critical to this, is companies engaging in particular with their insurance companies. Because if you want to look to who has really thought about what this looks like out into the future, it's the insurance companies, because it fundamentally affects their business model as a whole. And they probably have put more time into the data collection than anybody else has at this point. So I know we're really tight on time. I guess I'll stop there unless you have any other questions, but really it's about kind of embracing the unknown in some ways and adding it into everything you're looking at within your company, and for the board to also be able to say, okay, I don't have the information on that. I'm bringing somebody in and I'm going to learn the information on that so that I can make these assessments. If not in full information, in 60 or 80% of the information that's available, and let's start moving.
Anna Maria, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for being brief. I understand we actually have an auto cutoff, so we really only have 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, I'm just going to introduce Michael Mailing and let him speak for the minutes that we have left. I'm pleased to invite Professor Mailing, who's the Deputy Director of MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. He's also professor at the University of Strathclyde Law School, a hard one to say. Michael focuses on comparative and international climate policy and design and implementation, including its intersections with environment, energy, and trade policy. Michael, if you wouldn't mind in the 2 minutes we have to provide your perspective on how proactive policy change can create a more effective, attractive international landscape through climate risk disclosure policies, as discussed, and also policies on decarbonization and carbon pricing.
Thanks, Michael. I'll have a keen eye on the clock. That's a stop. And I think, there's been such a rich input already from all the speakers on the tremendous important role that MDBs are playing. I think, we know that public finance is only going to cover a relatively small share of that tremendous sum that Veselina mentioned of trillions per year. 2.5 trillion, I think, is one of the upper range estimates in investment in climate-related purposes. But I think we're seeing how important that public finance, that share is. I think the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in the US this summer with several $100 billion allocated to climate-related investment is already showing a market response. We have Emmanuel Macron concerned, that this is going to attract, because it de-risks investment in advanced technologies, in infrastructure, et cetera. It's going to actually shift some of the climate innovation from Europe to the United States. That's just a symbol of the power of public finance. And I think, very importantly, we have to leverage those abilities to technologies and to de-risk private sector investment. That's highlighted that important role. I'll just mention 2 things. I think carbon pricing, which is slowly but gradually continuing to expand, has actually in that area. It was sort of second tier for a long time because it's politically quite difficult, but we're starting to see some important benefit both on the revenue side and on the channeling and creating a favorable environment for private sector investment. And the MDBs I want to highlight have played a really important role in building capacity for these technically challenging instruments. Another thing that I think there's still untapped potential, and again, I'll keep it just very short, is thinking more about multi-investment, de-risking, guarantee mechanisms. Colleagues and I, we modeled savings that could be achieved with a relatively simple multilateral de-risking guarantee mechanism for energy in developing countries with trillions in savings at a relatively low cost for each participant in this mechanism. I'll leave it at that though, but I want to highlight, capacity building and public finance, just really, really important, and there's great work happening.
Thank you so much. Actually, you've done an incredible job of packing it into about 2 minutes. And I agree with you, and I agree with Michael. This has actually been an incredibly interesting discussion. I wish that we had had time for Q&A, but sometimes that happens. If we did start Q&A, it would cut off just as we were trying to answer. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much again, Michael, for being the organizer of all this, and thank you all for attending.